President Donald Trump announced that the United States has made a deal with Saudi Arabia in regard to their development of a civilian nuclear program. Now, what really stood out about this deal was the fact that it started, or at least the negotiations for it began under the Biden administration. And there was a pretty big caveat that the Biden administration insisted on. We're not going to let you pursue this program unless you normalize relations with Israel. Now, they didn't finish negotiating before Biden's term was up. Trump comes into office, he continues negotiating. And when he announced the deal, there was no mention of normalizing Saudi Arabia's relationship with Israel. So that caveat seemed to be totally removed. Well, now it looks like Trump got the call from the man who calls it the shots, the actual person who makes the decisions, and that's Benjamin Netanyahu. Because today, Trump did a complete 180, and it appears he did it unilaterally. So here's the headline from the Washington Post: Saudi nuclear deal in doubt as Trump adds new condition regarding Israel. A day after the agreement was signed, the president laid out a new requirement that the Saudis normalize relations with Israel. And then in the body of the piece, they write that the nuclear deal, which was fiercely opposed by Israel, which you can't have that, is totally subject to Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords, Trump said in a social media post. And then later, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt seemed to confirm that President Donald Trump made this decision unilaterally without even, talking to the Saudis and updating them on what he's demanding. Take a look.
Just to continue on the Saudi nuclear deal, do the Saudis agree with this interpretation since it wasn't part of the initial agreement? And has the president talked to MBS since this new condition was announced?
As you know, the president just put out this statement a few hours ago. I don't believe he's had a call with MBS in the hours since. However, this is something that he has raised in previous conversations and has also said many times in the past.
Now, before the 180 was carried out by President Trump, Trita Parsi, the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute, wrote about this civilian and nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia titled, The U.S.-Saudi Nuclear Deal Makes No Sense. How will Washington get Tehran to accept intrusive inspections beyond the JCPOA when Saudi is offered enrichment with no IAEA inspections? So luckily, to discuss this story with us today is Trita Parsi, and we will discuss, what the deal itself actually entails, and I'll get his comments on the latest update. Trita, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you again.
So before we even get to the 180 that Trump did this morning, I am very not curious because I read your piece, but I would like our audience to be familiar with the arguments that you're making in your piece, especially as it pertains to IAEA inspectors.
Yes, let me first say something that's very important to understand. This is not a new thing. The Biden administration pushed this very hard. And they were really building off of Trump's Abraham Accord. I mean, the only thing they seemed to care about in the Middle East was to get Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel. And as part of that package, they were entertaining offering security guarantees to Saudi Arabia on the level of NATO, which means that the United States would be obligated to come and defend Saudi Arabia. And of course, then the Saudis wanted to have this nuclear component to it. And there were moments in which after October 7th, when everything on the Abraham Accord kind of went to a standstill, that the Biden administration was contemplating doing just a standalone nuclear deal with the Saudis that would not have required them to normalize relations with Israel because the Israelis were paying very little attention to normalization at the time. They did recognize, however, that this would be a rather strange deal because the United States would essentially be giving the Saudis nuclear enrichment capability while simultaneously trying to deprive the Iranians from having that same technology and sanctioning them for having that technology. And they also recognized that this deal could give the Saudis a pathway to a nuclear weapon. And as a result, they were looking into, and I write about it in the Substack, they were looking into various ways of dealing with that issue, such as actually having American troops guard this nuclear facility and protect it from Saudis so that the Saudis would not be able to take over that facility that was in Saudi Arabia. They were even looking into having self-destruction mechanisms at the site, so to make sure that if the Saudis were going in a direction that the US didn't want, it could be destroyed. It's kind of bizarre that if you think that those measures may be necessary, perhaps that would be a hint that this is not a deal you should be doing in the first place. But the Biden administration was so adamant about binding Saudi Arabia to the United States out of the fear that it would be drifting away towards China. And as a result, they were contemplating these things. Now, the Trump administration essentially picked up from where the Biden team left it off. They're offered this, and as part of this team, this deal, the inspections would be American inspections. It wouldn't be the international standard of the IAEA going into these nuclear sites. It wouldn't be the same safeguards, etc., which then creates another complication with if they simultaneously still desire to make some sort of a nuclear deal with the Iranians, because the JCPOA had very intrusive inspections. And if you want to resurrect that, or if you even want to go beyond that, which I'm sure the Trump administration would love to do so they can say they got a better deal than Obama, how can you do then simultaneously give the Saudis something completely different? The whole argument, and the Trump administration has tried to deprive the Iranians from enrichment. Now, I don't think that ever would have worked. But what happened in February before the war was that there were proposals on the table that the Iranians had agreed to, in which they would have agreed to a couple of years of a moratorium on enrichment. They would not be enriching at all, which was a very surprising development in my view, because the Iranians have been so adamant to never agree to any type of a pause. And in the run up to the MOU, there were discussions in which the Iranians were coming along with an even longer moratorium, up to 12 years. How are you going to demand the Iranians to not enrich uranium for 12 years while you're simultaneously giving the technology to the Saudis? So it seems like, this side of the administration has no idea what the other side of the administration is doing. And as a result, these haphazard, contradictory proposals and deals that are being struck. And the ultimate end of it, of course, is that nothing gets achieved.
Right. That's exactly right. Now, in the case of the Biden administration, let's rewind for a second, because you said something that caught my attention. I understand why Biden, who was the top recipient of money from the Israel lobby, would be desperate to normalize relations with Israel. But was he motivated to provide this program for the Saudis? And if so, why?
It's really interesting. You have on the one hand this motivation, which was to really do something that pleased the Israelis. And the Biden administration, at first, when they were out of office, those officials were critical of the Abrams Accord. But then once they got into office, at first they were trying to find a way to do something that was similar, that wouldn't look as if they were building on it. They certainly didn't like the idea of having the same name because they didn't want to give Trump credit for it. But that was the only priority they had. And they sacrificed everything for that. It was partly driven by the idea that the administration that would be able to get the Saudis to drop all of their demands on the Palestinian issue and just cave to the Israelis would be a historic administration. It was also the requirement or the desire to make sure that in this new world that we were entering, that was increasingly becoming multipolar, certain key states, such as Saudi Arabia, because of its financial strength, because of its resources in terms of energy and oil, would be bound to the United States and really kept away from having some sort of a neutral role or playing both with the Chinese and with the United States. I mean, the Biden administration, their view of the movement towards multipolarity was much darker than what the current administration had. And as a result, again, they were willing to make massive sacrifices in order to be able to get the Saudis to agree to this. And they were willing to offer, frankly, insane concessions to the Saudis. And the other one that, of course, they were entertaining, and it seems like the Trump administration has at least avoided that one, is to offer the Saudis security guarantees that would go beyond anything the United States has done with them in the past, which would really obligate the United States to defend the Saudi kingdom and the royal family there. And there is a concern.
Pause.
Yeah.
Pause. Sorry to interrupt you, but this bears a little more elaboration. When you say security guarantees, are they the type of security guarantees that we provide to Israel, or are they like the type of security guarantees we provide to countries like Ukraine? I think there's a difference there.
There's a huge difference. And in some ways, actually, the Israeli ones are much more informal. There is not a formal treaty between the United States and Israel. There is a treaty between the United States and Turkey because Turkey is part of NATO. There isn't one between the US and Israel, but there is just this political commitment that at least existed up until recently. It seems to be, in some ways, at least public opinion is making it much more difficult to sustain. This would be something that would, at least what the Saudis demanded, would be on par with what the US has with NATO countries, which is the highest level that exists. It is essentially a defense pact. An attack on Saudi Arabia is going to be treated as an attack on the United States. And as much as the United States has had these informal commitments to Saudi Arabia, which it hasn't lived up to from the Saudi perspective, this would make it explicit and formal. And it would be a slap in the face of all of the promises that administrations such as the Biden administration and certainly the Trump administration has made, which is we need to get out of the Middle East. This is the opposite. This is truly binding ourselves, entangling ourselves by a treaty to the internal affairs of the Middle East and signing up to actually treat any attack on Saudi Arabia as an attack on the United States.
What would happen if Israel attacks Saudi Arabia? I mean,
that's interesting. Yeah. It's an interesting question because this is part of the problem. The United States gives too many security guarantees. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes in conflicts, it actually has a commitment, one, informal or formal, to both sides in that conflict, which is part of the reason I think a strong argument to really review this and recognize that we should not be committing ourselves in this matter. And the more we do, the less value it has because the credibility of these security guarantees becomes less when we are overextending ourselves.
Well, shockingly, Israel might actually be useful in this very specific scenario, because I'm not entirely convinced that even if Saudi Arabia agreed to the Abraham Accords, that Israel would be okay with them having a civilian nuclear program. Yeah. And to be fair to the Israelis, which people think I'm never fair to them, but in this case, I will be, because Saudi Arabia has expressed some interest in obtaining a nuclear weapon as a deterrent. And I don't blame them for wanting that, given what we're seeing in the Middle East right now. If you have a nuclear weapon, you're far less likely to be attacked by the United States. And I think right now, with Israel as our ally, many countries in that region are worried about being attacked either now or eventually by the United States.
And here's where there is an argument, and it's actually backed up with facts. Once you give the country the type of nuclear technology that the US is now offering the Saudis, then they also have the leverage of saying, well, if you don't give us the security guarantees, then we will go nuclear and we will build a nuclear bomb, because now they have the capability of doing so. So even though there is no security guarantee as part of this deal, and perhaps the Trump administration really didn't want to give that to the Saudis, this may provide the Saudis with the leverage in which down the road they can issue such threats in order to get it. This is what South Korea, for instance, have been able to do. And now we have massive security guarantees to South Korea. In fact, we have by law, there's a US law that says that we can never have less than 25,000 troops in South Korea.
Wow. So let's fast forward to what was announced today, which is that Trump very clearly did an about face. And now he's saying that normalization with Israel is mandatory in order for this deal to get through. And this isn't related to the Saudi nuclear deal, but I think that it's telling of how the Israelis view their influence on us and on Donald Trump particularly. So Benjamin Netanyahu went on some Israeli television show and he said the following. After Trump gets elected, he says, I went in with 7 big slides. Quote, here's what we're going to do, he told Trump. Not, are you allowing us or don't you? I told him about Fordo and said your B2s would be much more effective. He listened, and in the end, he joined. So it's amazing because if you talk about the undue influence of Israel on our government, you get called an anti-Semite. But the Israelis brag about it, they boast about it on a regular basis. They rub it in our faces. So do you think that Trump, basically did the 180 because of the Israelis and their backlash, or could there be another reason?
I cannot see any other plausible reason as to why he would have changed this and said that it is contingent upon them joining the Abraham Accord. I mean, that was the only other conditions that the Israelis wanted. If it was because of a backlash against the deal itself, he would have walked out of the deal. He would have recognized that, yeah, it doesn't make sense giving that technology while you're trying to deprive others from having that technology. It doesn't make sense. I mean, it at a minimum, do it later. It complicates a potential deal with Iranians. So, if that was the case, he would have had a different reaction. It would have nothing to do with the Israelis joining the Abraham Accord. So the only plausible explanation is that there was a massive backlash from the Israeli side and from the pro-Israeli side, because the deal that was on the table, or that they were discussing before, the problem the Israelis had with it was not security guarantees to Saudi Arabia. They were fine with that. What they were having a major problem with was either if the language on the Palestinian state was too strong, and I can tell you what it was really weak, but mainly it was the nuclear component. They did not want to see that technology in the hands of the Saudis, and now suddenly have to worry that potentially the Saudis will also go nuclear. On the Palestinian state, they were toying with ideas, not, the strongest language was a pathway to a Palestinian state. We've been on a pathway to a Palestinian state for 7 decades. It means nothing. But they even weakened that to be a political horizon for the Palestinians. They didn't even mention a state. So it was at that level, but the real concern was the nuclear issue, and that this would be given to them as part of a normalization. But I don't think that's the key reason why the Israelis didn't go that direction. I think what they saw after October 7 is that they could just annex all of the Palestinian territory. The US would be fine with it. So why make a deal with the Saudis in order to be able to go down that path? You can already go down.
Oh, that's a devastating point.
That's
a great point. Oh, you're so right about that. Well, I think in the end, given how the Israelis feel about this deal, it's unlikely to actually come to fruition. And I think that's probably a good thing.
I wouldn't be so sure. I mean, they're going to make their opposition to it. I think in this case, I think it's very fascinating. There's a deal. He announced it. He brags about it. And next day, he just fundamentally changes the terms of the deal on Twitter. What does it do? It sends a signal to everyone. Not only can you not trust Trump's promises, you cannot even trust his signature. Even if he negotiates a deal, it's a treaty, whatever it is, it's formalized. He can back away from it. Now, will he really back away from it? I think it's a struggle. It's a question mark at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if it would go forward in some ways, because there's financial interest involved as well, with investments by Saudi in the United States, buying Westinghouse reactors. But nevertheless, a complication has clearly been created here.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.